Well, it's Thursday. You know what that means.
You know what that means.
I know what that means. It's Rhetoric Thursday, right? Rhetoric
Yes.
being the art of speaking. Have I learned that correctly?
You got it, man.
Cool. So what do you guys have for us today to share?
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the slippery slope fallacy. Now, this is an interesting fallacy in our current culture because it's an actual logical fallacy, and we'll talk about its false usages in a second. But it's also really interesting in our society because even though it is a fallacy, some people have described arguments falsely as this fallacy when they're actually not. So let me give you what the fallacy actually is. And then we'll go through some biblical examples as well as examples that are happening in our culture right now to hopefully help you guys understand what it is. And again, how to avoid using it yourself and also how to address it when people either misuse it, misappropriate it, or use it in their own communication. So what the slippery slope is when you make a statement or you come up with a point or a philosophical idea and somebody attacks not the point itself, but what the point might lead to. So a really good example of this just happened in the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So when the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade and said that there was no right to privacy contained in the Constitution, which was the entire basis for Roe versus Wade, some people argued that, well, that's a slippery slope because the fundamental right to privacy is what allowed for, say, marriages between different races. Right? Now, the reason why that was a slippery slope fallacy is because they didn't argue from there is no right to privacy, so therefore no abortion. They argued from the sanctity of life and the fact that you can't take away the sanctity of life or the right to life by the federal government without an explicit constitutional amendment. That was the idea. So it had nothing to do with interracial marriage because obviously you have the right and ability in our country to marry whom you choose. So that was just a very foolish thing, but that would be an example of a slippery slope fallacy. Now, the way that it's misused today is that there are various points of view in which people will say, well, if we do this, it might lead to that. And someone will say, well, no, it won't. That's a slippery slope fallacy. When in reality, what the idea is, the logical conclusion would be what people are saying. So I know it sounds very abstract. I'll give you guys a couple instances to help you understand it in a second. But anything you'd like to add or clarify on that before we get into it?
Yeah, just laying down the algebra, so to speak. It's that A leads to B when that's not necessarily the case. Like we talked about last week in the idea of attributing motive, you believe this when that's not always the case. We want to make sure that when we're talking to people, we give their idea the benefit of the doubt. So in noting these examples, how does that form in a mistake? And also we'll talk a little bit about how you can actually argue this point without it being a fallacy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you the kind of the big one that's going on today, the transgender debate. Okay, so all the way back in 1700 and around 1790, I think, a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft, who was one of the first purveyors of the feminist movement, wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And in it, she was arguing that women should have civil rights provided to them in society that were previously only afforded to men. Rights to work, rights to vote, things like that. Now, the problem is that the basis of her argumentation was based on the fact that women were arbitrarily put into this category of being wives and homemakers, and therefore society as a whole could just overturn that. Now, a guy named Edmund Burke, he argued a slippery slope fallacy, right? Well, she accused him of the slippery slope fallacy, but it actually wasn't. What he said is the reason why these institutions exist, wife and motherhood, is because they're necessary for society. It's not that they were arbitrarily placed upon women by evil, corrupt men. And if you take away these institutions, what you're actually doing is destroying the roles that are necessary for society. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft was like, slippery slope fallacy, that would never happen. Well, just a couple years later, a guy named John Stuart Mill said this: women are subjected to duties in wives and mothers because the whole force of education enslaves women's minds to such roles. He wrote that in The Subjection of Women. What do you see there? You see, no, the roles of wife and mother are subjugations of women. They're not good at all, right? So the way that we'll talk about how someone could have argued against the slippery slope fallacy, but you see him He's not arguing against the slippery slope that Edmund Burke talked about. He's like, no, you're right. That is where I want it to go. I want it to go to the idea that there are no more roles or institutions for women because they naturally subjugate women. So then a woman named Simone de Beauvoir in I think she wrote this in the 1940s. She wrote a book called The Second Sex. And this is what she thinks about that. The woman is a female to the extent that that she feels herself as such. And some essential biological givens are not part of her lived situation. So once again, your biology has nothing to do with being a mother. That sounds weird, but that's what she's saying. Your biology has nothing to do with being a woman. It has nothing to do with being a mother. That is just all arbitrary. It's all societal. And once again, she says this later on, nature does not define woman. It is she who defines herself by reclaiming nature for herself in her affectivity. Once again, not even my biology, not even my nature tells me that I'm a woman. I just decide, just out of nowhere that I am a woman, and therefore that's what makes me a woman. I don't have to be a wife. I don't have to be a mother. And in fact, those institutions, once again, subjugate women. We need to get rid of them. Now people brought up another slippery slope. They say, well, Simone, it kind of sounds like what you're saying is that men and women are interchangeable. And if men and women are interchangeable, doesn't that mean that it would allow for not only same-sex marriage, but even switching of genders? And they said, no way, that can never happen. Why would that ever come into your mind? All I'm saying is that just being a woman is something that you decide, and therefore you could do whatever you want. Well, let's fast forward just a little bit later. This is Shulamith Firestone. She wrote this in 1979, a book called The Dialectic of Sex. Now, listen to this. Until a certain level of evolution had been reached and technology had achieved its present sophistication, to question fundamental biological conditions was insanity. We are no longer just animals, and the kingdom of nature does not reign absolute. The end goal of the feminist revolution must be, unlike the first feminist movement, not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. Genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally. A reversion of an unobstructed pansexuality of Freud's polymorphous perversity would probably supersede hetero-homo bisexuality. The reproduction of the species by one sex at the benefit of both would be replaced by artificial reproduction. Children would be born to both sexes equally. No more men, no more women. We're just interchangeable. Our biology has nothing to do with who we are. And this is in 1979. So if you're looking around, you're like, why did gender ideology get all crazy all of a sudden? This is not all of a sudden, right? People predicted this is what happened almost 100 years ago, but they were called slippery slope fallacy. Now, how could someone have actually answered this? How would you actually answer the slippery slope fallacy if it really was a fallacy?
Well, that's the tricky part, is the only way to challenge this sort of position is with examples and demonstrable patterns. If you just say, your idea leads to this without an example, I have no reason to believe your conclusion or claim are valid. But if you can show a pattern of thought, or you can show examples where this has led to that, then you're not arguing on a slippery slope. You're acknowledging the slope is slippery and that you want to avoid it.
That's right. So you are showing that I can prove that A does lead to B. Not I'm worried that it would, but I could see it. It's like if you saw someone eating large amounts of junk food from their local 7-Eleven, and you said, well, that's going to make you fat one day. Slippery slope fallacy, man. I'm just eating this junk food. Who says that it's going to make me fat or obese? No. That's not a slippery slope fallacy. That's just called nature. It's like when you're putting that in your body's going to react to that in a very predictable way. So if someone were to argue against the so-called slippery slope fallacy, what someone would have had to have done early on in the movement is they would have had to have shown definitively our philosophy does not lead to that, right? So no. So if Mary Wollstonecraft all the way back in the 1700s would have said, no, I'm not saying that men and women are interchangeable. What I'm saying is that we should have a right to vote based on natural human law and dignity. Women are made in the image and likeness of God as well. Therefore, the same rights afforded to men should be afforded to women. but I also recognize the importance of sex distinction, and I also recognize the importance of a mother in a home, right? If she would have said that, then that would have actually diffused the slippery slope fallacy. But that's not what she said. They said slippery slope fallacy, and then they doubled down on the philosophy that would have necessarily led to the exact world that we're living in right now. So is there an example of this in the Bible? Well, yes, there is. There's actually multiple examples of this, but this is my favorite. So this is Romans chapter 3, verse 7. And what Paul has laid out, by the way, is he's laid out a doctrine of salvation by grace. Because he said, well, if we're all sinners, we're all a mess. If you read through Romans 1 through 3, that's the whole point. We're all sinners, we're all a mess. The only way we have access to God is by faith. Well, what is the slippery slope that might be present there? Well, in verse 7, he says this, for if the truth of God is increased through my lie to his glory, why am I still judged as a sinner? And why not say, let us do evil that good may come, as we are slanderously and reported, and as some affirm that we say their condemnation is just. So he's saying they're looking at Paul's philosophy and they're saying, well, if that's true, Paul, well, then let's just keep sinning that God's glory is magnified even more through the grace that he might show to us.
Yeah, Romans 6:1, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? But notice, he clarifies.
That's right. So how do you answer it when the slippery slope fallacy is given to you? Well, he answers it a little bit here, but then in Romans 6, he clarifies it even better. So here, if you want to read on your own time, is a little bit of a more lengthy response, a little bit more well thought out. But in Romans 6, verse 1, he says this, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who have died to sin live any longer in it? And then he goes on from there. There's a lot more that I can pull apart, but essentially this is what he does. He acknowledges his premise, right? He doesn't deny it. He's not like, you're totally wrong. I didn't say that you're just saved by grace through faith. No, he's like, no, I did. I absolutely said that. But being saved by grace through faith should not motivate someone to sin more. Why? Because grace through faith acknowledges the fact that you had to be saved from something. Why would you continue in the thing that killed you? That doesn't make any sense. We died to sin, right? So if I come before God on my knees and I recognize that my behaviors are not only separating me from a relationship with him, but they're also negatively affecting my life, my relationships, I'm recognizing my depravity. Why on earth would someone who's making that recognition then say, oh, I'm forgiven. Now let me go back to the thing that you just saved me from, God. That would be ridiculous, right? Now, Paul's not saying that someone wouldn't do that. He's just saying that they're being idiots if they do. And he goes on throughout the rest of Romans 6 to talk about that. So notice what he does. He acknowledges the premise of his philosophy. He acknowledges what the person said. This is the slippery slope that you've acknowledged. Then he shows this doesn't have to lead to that. There is a way to adopt this particular philosophy without going in that direction. And this is how you do that, right? So that's how you acknowledge and diffuse it. So,
we can conclude on that point, but just again to recap, if you're accused of the slippery slope fallacy, well, if we make it illegal, then that will lead to other things being made illegal. You either A, have to clarify, no, that won't lead to that, or you have to admit that could lead to that, but how is this being employed? Be careful with your words, which is the basis of rhetoric, and also be sensitive to words as well. Because if a discernometer ding goes off in your head and you say, that doesn't sound like it's leading anywhere good, the first and most important thing to do is Rhetoric Lesson 101. Listen to what's actually being said. Make sure that if that sounds like it will lead in a wrong direction, don't automatically accuse them of supporting this down the road idea. Challenge it so that it doesn't, and you can understand their position as well as your own.